In the church where I was at in Sun Lakes, there was a church member. Bob Wallace was his name. He was one of the smartest person that I had ever met. I mean, he knew a lot about everything, and not just by way of opinion. He knew a lot about everything because he was a voracious reader. I found out that he had thought about going into the seminary, but as he worked through his degrees, he was actually had a PhD that he had gotten from a major university. But I found out in talking with him that he had been a student or in the class of one of the great biblical scholars and theologians of the 20th century in the United States. This theologian's name was Rudolf Bultmann. I don't know, has anybody ever heard of Rudolf Bultmann? His main thing was demythologizing the New Testament, was to take it back to, he was one of the first to begin the study of the scripture in its original sources, and not just as people have, interpreted over the centuries. And I said, what? Seriously? You were a student? Oh, yeah. And one day he brought a paper in that he had done for Rudolf Bultmann, and there was all the comments on this paper. And I was just like, I was in awe because this man had contact with somebody who was such a huge figure in modern scholarship in the United States. Americans were not, he was German, but Americans were not noted for being good scholars in Scripture, and Rudolf Bultmann began that process of really raising up American scholars over the centuries. Sadly, he got the eye disease and went blind within a year. And for somebody who had been such a voracious reader, I just can't imagine how devastating that could have been for him. But he was so determined that thankfully his daughter got him Alexa, and he could talk to Alexa, and Alexa had access to this vast library. So he continued to listen to books on Alexa, even though he could no longer read. I think of that because I have worn glasses since the 7th grade, and while I'm not completely blind without my glasses, it is hard the first thing I do when I get up in the morning is put my glasses on. So about 3 and 4 months ago, when I went for my regular eye doctor checkup, she said, it looks like the beginning of, what are those things, cataracts. And I went, oh dear God, I mean, it's not only that I delayed getting bifocals on my glasses till I was past 40, because I just thought it was horrendous to have bifocals before I'm 40. But now that I'm 70, I suppose cataracts are to be expected. But thankfully, those who have gone through the process know that over the years they've greatly improved how they do this, and so it's not as traumatic. But to be honest with you, I can't even put eye drops in my eyes because of that's why I could never wear contacts. So eyesight is a very precious thing that we all probably take for granted often. And so the possibility, like my friend Bob Wallace, to lose it completely is just scary, to be honest with you. Let me just comment about the scripture and then to move to a reflection on what this is. First of all, in the context of the gospel, chapter 9 follows a long series of things that are happening in Jesus' relationship with the crowds and the people and the Pharisees. So you hear it in this one where he's continuing to have this ongoing conversation that really is edged by their opposition to Jesus and his attempt to help them understand. And that's, of course, John's perspective. How are you understanding who Jesus is, and how ready are you to accept who Jesus is? And the opposition is increasingly getting more resistive to the thought of accepting Jesus. So that's the chapter right before this. So you hear the conflict in this chapter as well. But the second thing is, and this is a much larger conversation that I know people still today struggle with. And it has to do with, notice as they encounter this man who is blind, that the question is raised by the disciples. What did this man do to cause him to be blind? Was there some sin in his life that, in a sense, the blindness is a punishment from God? Or was there a sin of his parents that they committed that he would be born this way? I hear this frequently from the nurses that I teach, because they talk about patients who have come in with disease, with cancer or some other kind of very difficult heart disease or something, and because of their faith, the level of their faith, that they often will say, "What did I do to deserve this?" As if my heart disease or my cancer is a punishment for my sin in the past. And I often think, because that may work for those of us who are older, but is that true for a little baby just born into the world, that some disease that they have, that they might die from very quickly? What a terrible connection to make, right, between sin and disease. But this is what the ancients believed that we still somehow hold on to. In the e-Sojourner, I did some research on it, and indeed the Greek and the Romans believed that, if you had, sniffles or something like that, that was just normal. That was the normal experience of being a body in the world, a human person in the world. And so they had the herbs and the salves that they would use, and that would go away pretty quickly. But for more serious illnesses, they really did believe that somehow or another the gods were punishing you because of something that you did. You forgot the god's birthday, or the god's anniversary. Like, far be it from any husband to forget the anniversary of their marriage with their wife. That's why my license plate has my wedding anniversary date. So at least I've got always a way to remember it. Not that I would ever forget it, to be honest. So that the ancients really did believe this, because they didn't understand the origin of serious illnesses. People thought that if somebody, fell down and was foaming and wreathing at the mouth, that they must be demon-possessed. Probably it was epilepsy, but they didn't know that. They didn't know what epilepsy was, and so they were demon-possessed, that somehow the gods were punishing them. Or even leprosy. They didn't know what the origins of leprosy, or what we call today Hansen's disease. They didn't know that. And so because it was something that they didn't know, then there must be a connection between the moral choices that the person has made and the way that the God was intervening in their life to teach them a lesson. But I want you to hear again, and I tell my nurses this because sometimes they miss that part, is that Jesus clearly rejects that kind of connection. So we have to be absolutely committed to the point that anybody who has a serious illness has not committed some sin that they need to ask God to forgive them, that there was no sin in that person's past or in their parents or grandparents or however many generations back, that there was no sin that any of them committed that brings on the disease. It's still a mystery for many, right, today. Even the scientists and doctors don't always know what the origins of certain diseases are, that they're still researching and studying, and so we're still discovering. Most likely some break in the genome where genes get broken, and so disease is attached to a particular gene. Well, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So that's the first thing, that the story is clearly rejecting the connection between the man's blindness and any sin. The second thing is fascinating through the story is that this man can now see. Yet, how do they call him? The man who is blind, the blind man. So that, how many people go to recovery for, go to AA or recovery from drug addiction, but no attempt on their part to show that their lives have changed convinces many of us that they really are changed, because people still think of them as drug addicts or alcoholics. And even within AA, if I got it right? I mean, once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, and you just, have the greater strength and the greater perseverance and willpower to not drink. But you're still an alcoholic, so you still think of yourself, even though your life is completely different. Even though that might have been in the past 30 years. I have friends who constantly are posting on Facebook that it's their 30 years of sobriety that they've had, and yet they still kind of think even of themselves in that way. So it's fascinating that even though this man can see, nobody ever says, oh, there's the man who sees. They say, no, there's the man who is blind. And already you get some connection that something about the blindness has brought that person to the very edge of the community, right? He was a beggar. Well, why? Because he couldn't do for himself. And in a sense, you notice how even the parents say, well, he's old enough. At least the parents are giving him some agency for himself, right? He's old enough, let him speak. But prior to that, probably nobody gave him the time of day or even would stop to throw, a couple of coins into his basket to help him out. So he was at the very edge of the community's life and had no livelihood, right? They didn't have, the foundation for the blind that, empower people who are blind to be, constructive and productive people in the community. They didn't have that. You were out. And so not only is this man continued to be called the man who is blind, but in the back of it, there's nothing to suggest that he ever is welcomed wholeheartedly back into the community and is now a productive member of that community. He's still kind of on the edge, obviously, because they keep telling him, you're the man who is blind, you should get used to your life over there, right? Why would you want to be a part of the community? But notice in the discussion, Jesus says that this blindness has a purpose. Well, yeah, right, that's easy for him to say, right? Who would ever say that their disease or their illness has a greater purpose? Interesting, right? Is this an opportunity for something? Now, Jesus suggests that it's an opportunity for the disciples and for everyone else. He doesn't say it's an opportunity for the man. He says this is an opportunity for us to discover something about the way God works, or could work, or is working, or has worked, whatever phase of time we want to be in, right? And so the discussion, and as it unfolds, notice they keep asking him. The poor guy, you have to kind of add the tone of voice. Look, if I have to tell you one more time how this happened, I'm just going to, scream at you, or, I'm going to punch you in the face, or, I have to imagine that he got pretty upset by the fourth time that he asked, well, how did this happen? Who did this? I've told you all of that already. Why are you continuing to interrogate me when I told you, first of all, I don't know who he is. He just did it for me. And secondly, how many more times are you not going to believe or accept what has happened? Now that might be how the story turns, right? Well, so let me consider this. Again, I did some research, and I have about 30 pages here, because I found it interesting that in our English language, we have various idioms, right? Various idioms that we use. So like this one here, this first thing that I have is, what does "can't see the forest for the trees" mean? Right? I mean, have you ever used that phrase? Boy, there's somebody who can't see the forest for the trees. What the heck does that mean? So the commentator here says, and this is 15 pages just on that idiom. So he says it's used when describing a person who cannot see a situation they are in as it truly is. Instead, they get lost in the details of it and lose perspective on the bigger issue. In other words, one who gets blinded by a situation they are fully involved in. That doesn't sound like anybody we know, maybe, perhaps, huh? So imagine that we use an idiom about sight, that we can't see the forest for the trees, to talk about a situation where we get caught up in the details of something and we can't see the bigger picture anymore. So we're seeing, but are we really seeing? See? So the idiom is, this one has 25 useful expressions and idioms with eyes in them. Amazing, huh? A sight for sore eyes. All eyes on. Keep an eye for an eye. There's one, right? That's one that Jesus again makes reference to. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But what I say to you is, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, is how he turns it around, rejecting that. Cry your eyes out. To be the apple of someone's eye. Turn a blind eye. All eyes and ears. So there, you can check them all out for yourselves, right? And here's another one that goes on. It has 20 of them here that have eyes bigger than your stomach. Well, that one I know, right? That you go, wow, look at this. Go to a buffet and try that. That's why I don't go to the buffets anymore, because I end up eating more than I really should. Because, wow, look at this. Oh, wow, look at this. Oh, wow, look at this. And pretty soon you're throwing food away because your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and you can't really eat all of that, right? Keep your eye on the ball. So you see, it's come into our common language where sight and eyes play some kind of role in our recognition, either of our own shortcomings or you see somebody who's really lost contact with reality and therefore can't see the bigger picture. So, there's somebody who, can't see the forest for the trees. And so we use these idioms to describe not a physical blindness, real blindness where you can't see at all, but some kind of blindness that, we're walking around seeing, but we're really not seeing. So something about that has all come all the way from, the ancient times into the present. So notice how it goes. The discussion of the Pharisees is, how can Jesus do this when he's already violated the Sabbath? How can he possibly be from God? Because God is the only one that can do this. How can he do this? And so what the man says, I don't know. In other words, he's not going to get caught up in the discussion as to what the origin of Jesus is. What is he interested in? What is he thinking about? I see. Isn't that interesting how simple it is, huh? I see. I don't know. What, you want me to sit down with Rudolf Bultmann and get into a theological discussion over that, right? There was a famous theologian, I think it was Karl Rahner, the Catholic theologian, And there was this paragraph, Jesus is the inevitable, and it went through all of these. It had 50 seven-letter theological words in this. And this is, Jesus asking a disciple who I am, and they give this 2 paragraphs long description, and at the end of it, Jesus goes, huh? Have you made this more complicated than what it needs to be? So notice, what is this about the last phrase, right? You Pharisees, you're seeing, but you're not seeing. This man sees, and he's come to realize and accept, who is he, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, the one talking to you. So there he is. He sees him. He knows the origin of his. But I want to ask this, because much like these idioms and proverbs about eyes, give some way for us to describe or have an understanding of the shortcomings of our ability to see. That here, blindness is not any longer about physical blindness, where you can't see either from birth or from something happens over life, like my friend Bob Wallace becomes blind. So he has some ability to image, right? I think of Helen Keller. Remember how Helen Keller, when Annie Sullivan tries to get her connected to reality, and finally Helen Keller is able to put a word that Annie Sullivan is saying to her with the physical reality, because she has no experience whatsoever of water or the pump. So that some connection has to be made between the image that one maybe doesn't have in their mind to what the reality is. So the same with sighted people, perhaps, we who are sighted, that some connection has to be made for us between more than just what we see. Well, here in the lectionary this weekend, the first reading from the Old Testament is the story where Samuel is told to go choose a new king for Israel. And so this is a dangerous job because the king is still alive, and so he's choosing the successor to Saul. And so he goes down to the house of Jesse, and Jesse has 7 sons. And so each son is paraded before Samuel, and Samuel goes, wow, this guy looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's going to be the king. And God says, nope, not him. And the next guy comes along, and he looks like Rudolph Boltmann, the most intelligent, intellectual guy you could ever imagine. And Samuel goes, oh, that's the king. And God says, nope, not him. And all 6 sons go by, and God says, not one of them is king. And so Samuel says, do you have any more? Jesse sheepishly says, yes. But, he's out in the field with the sheep. And Samuel says, go get him. And the storyteller says, and when David comes in, he's ruddy. Well, of course, if you've been out in the sun, out in the field all day, you're going to look a little red. But you can imagine he comes in smelling like wet sheep. He's the last person to be thought of. And God says, that's the one. Stop judging, God says to Samuel. Stop judging by external appearances and see into the heart. Think about where we are today in the world and at Chalice. How often we see or we don't see because we're blinded by our prejudice or our bias or our ignorance, whatever it might be, that we are stopped in our tracks from interacting with another human being simply because of how they look. Think about back a few years ago, and I cautioned Steve as a Hispanic. I said, the sheriff of our county is out to get anybody who is brown-skinned regardless of the character of the person, because he had come to believe that every brown-skinned person was a rapist, a drug dealer, and a sex trafficker. And he had convinced himself and convinced many people that that was true. And so all of a sudden, we're out trying to track brown people down simply because he has created an image of a person that really was not true. Maybe there were individuals that would apply to, but the whole race of people? Think about how in the struggle the last couple of years over Black Lives Matter, so that every black person you encounter is immediately judged to be a threat simply because of their skin color? And aren't we always amazed? I am, to be honest. I am when a black person speaks articulately better than me. Huh? What? Black people don't talk like that. They talk in slang and they talk gutter language. You see how our thought about another person because of their skin color stops us from really seeing the character of the person? Is every immigrant bad? Wow, none of us in this room would be here unless you're Native American, if that was true. And what contributions have immigrants made to our country? If we were to see and judge them, as many were, right? The kind of language that we use to often describe spick, wop, you could just go on down the line. What does that do? That labels a person because of our blindness to see the dignity and the humanness of the person. It can go on, right? To many more things. So you see, but you don't see. That might be the sin. I've come to bring sight to the blind, but you persist in your blindness, meaning you can't accept who I am. So the challenge is, what blindness do we carry around with us every day that prevents us from truly seeing other people for who they are in the image of God?